Yeah, messieurs! Welcome back to the Spearfishing channel. In this video, I went out with my good friend Make It Happen on his boat and we killed some really nice fish. We went out for 2 days back to back, and on the first day we kinda stayed in the shallower range between 20 and 30 feet. While I was on the surface, I saw a really nice queen parrotfish run underneath this rock. So when I was looking under the different holes and I finally found the fish, I pulled the trigger. I feel really lucky to have hit that fish because I find it so hard to aim my big 110 underneath holes. Usually when I'm shooting under rocks, I have to look at the fish first, then back up and fire in the general direction where I first saw it. Sometimes it works out perfectly like you just saw, and other times I just miss the fish completely. I had to make quite a few drops to detangle that mess that the parrotfish left me, and once I finally got my spear through and looked over the other side, I realized that I had a Spanish hogfish and my parrotfish on my line. I didn't even know that the hogfish was in the hole when I pulled the trigger, so it was a really nice surprise to have had that fish on. Those are a really popular eating fish here in St. Lucia, so it was a nice little surprise for a bycatch. I remember on that day I didn't get much footage because we were really just targeting podfish and not the bigger species that I would normally go for. With that being said, I still think that this hunt was quite interesting and it was cool to have gotten that 2-for-1 on camera. With the first portion of the day going so slow, I wasn't recording much, but by the end of the day we tried out a new spot and I turned on my camera. As soon as I started heading down, I saw a really nice school of mahogany snappers swimming away from me, and instead of trying to attract them, I settled for this nice schoolmaster. I put in a really good shot, hitting the fish in the spine, paralyzing it from the midsection down. That's always a good shot placement because it almost guarantees that you won't lose that fish. I also kinda lied when I said that this is a new spot. Make It Happen has been telling me about that spot for a long time, and he always told me about the schoolmasters and mahogany snappers that stay around that area. However, I was really impressed with the size of the mahogany snappers I was seeing, and I knew I would want to go for one on my next dive. This mark is a really old shipwreck in about 20 feet, so as I was going down, I knew I was going to have a lot of bottom time to explore. While I was down, I was kinda peeking underneath the sheets of metal to maybe see a big grouper or a snapper. We don't really get many big groupers in St. Lucia, and my biggest grouper is a 2.5 pound strawberry grouper or red hind. Coincidentally, that fish is actually going to show up later on in this video. I didn't really spend too much time looking around underneath the wreck, and when I looked to my left I saw that same school of mahogany snappers. Mahogany snappers are some of the hardest fish to get close to, so when I turned my gun I made sure to do it as slowly as possible so they didn't spook. I also kept my eyes off them so they would be more curious and come in closer. When I looked back, I actually noticed that there were some nice chubs in the school, so I was going to go for a shot on them first. But when I saw I wasn't going to get the angle, I picked out one of the nice mahogany snappers. That may look like a small fish, but as far as mahogany snappers go, that's a really big one. The biggest I've seen is only a couple of pounds, and when they get to that size you can tell it's a really old fish. I also really like hunting mahogany snappers because people who don't really eat potfish but want something pan-sized to eat would more want something like a mahogany snapper, which is still small but really good eating. Most times with mahogany snappers you'll only get one chance at the school, but I still made another drop to see if I could get one more fish. While I was making my drop, I knew that I was going to need quite a bit of bottom time to attract those snappers, so I took my extra time and looked underneath the wreck some more to see if I would run into anything bigger. Even though it looked like prime grouper or snapper territory, I didn't see anything underneath the wreck, so I kept my head up and just scanned the area like I normally would on a blind drop. The key to bringing fish in, whether you can see them or not, is just to stay calm on the bottom and pretend like you're supposed to be there. As long as the fish feel like you're not a predator in their environment, their curiosity will get the better of them and they'll actually come right up to you. Once I noticed the fish hanging just out of my range, I slowly turned my gun towards them and waited for them to present a shot. Once I thought they were in my range, I moved a little closer and extended my arm for a shot. I popped that fish with a solid holding shot and went to the surface with my second big mahogany snapper. It was getting kinda late in the day, and after I shot that fish, they stopped coming close to us, so we decided to pack up for the day. When I got to the boat, I remember Make It Happen commenting on how they couldn't get close to those mahogany snappers before that day, and all it really came down to was having enough bottom time and having the proper hunting technique to draw those fish in. The next day rolled around and we were back at it, but at a different spot this time. This mark is a massive rock that comes up from 60 feet all the way up to the surface. It's a spot where I've heard of multiple king mackerels being shot, with one of those being a 22-pounder caught by my good friend George. He also has a YouTube channel and I'll have it linked in the description. As I touched the bottom, I started scanning up the water column trying to look for one of those kings. And as I wasn't paying attention, this really big mutton snapper swam in front of me just out of my range. That fish was probably 10 to 15 pounds, and if I was paying attention, I could have put my head down and let it get curious and come towards me. I just wasn't prepared to see a snapper of that size, and it ended up going off into the deep after it spooked. Part of me was hoping that that fish would have came back around after I didn't react to it spooking, but it never showed back up. While I was still looking around and waiting for that mutton snapper to come back, I had such an insane encounter with a mackerel that I couldn't even believe what I was seeing. This tiny Cero popped out of nowhere and came so close to me I could have just reached out and touched it. I've never seen mackerel behave like this before, and it was so close you could even see my reflection on the side of the fish. As my breath hold was finishing, I started to hear the boat engine, so I knew it was time for us to pack up and change spots. I think that tiny mackerel was one of the coolest things that I've ever seen, and it's crazy to think that that little fish could grow up into a double-digit monster. Other than that one mutton snapper, that mark seemed pretty dead for the day, so we decided to move off to another mark that has been known to hold big barracudas. I made a couple drops before this clip and I immediately noticed that the water was way dirtier than on the other mark. Also, the current was way stronger, and without being able to see the bottom from the surface, I was just making blind drops. As I started to see the shapes of the boulders that made up the reef here, I saw an obscenely large school of grunts. I don't think I've ever seen this many grunts in one place, and I also noticed that there were some nice grey snappers and even a couple mutton snappers mixed in with that school. Normally I would have just gone for a grunt, but those snappers are higher on my target list. I noticed that all of the fish seemed to be going behind that big boulder, so I crept over just to see if I would get an angle on a snapper. All of the grunts started passing in front of me, and I noticed this nice grey snapper come out of the cave by the side of the boulder. I took the shot and my spear went all the way through the fish and it was strung on my shooting line. I tried to keep it free from the structure, but I wasn't able to in time, so I had to open my reel and go to the surface. Once I hit the surface, that fish had somehow untangled itself and it was just coming up as I pulled. That big school of grunts and snappers had me really hopeful for what was to come, but that spot didn't produce after that, so we changed spots yet again. Right as we hopped in the water, I saw Make It Happen going down to line up on a fish. He shot a really nice glasseye snapper, which are one of my main target species when I'm not seeing those bigger reef fish or pelagics. These are really good eating and that's about an average size for them. We continued diving that zone for a little while and just got some pot fish, so again we decided to change spots. I didn't even have time to fully load my gun and George had already shot this big mutton snapper. That fish came in at 10 pounds, which is a really nice size for them, and I was super surprised he got it so shallow.
So this is what's the snapper, boy? Yes. That break 10 pounds, eh?
Guys, I get that just lie down at the side of a rock.
Real?
Real thick. I just see that there. I say, huh? A big snapper passing there, yeah.
After seeing him with that fish, I moved off to look for a fish of my own. While I was on the surface swimming around, I saw a nice grunt come out of a hole and go back in. I decided to make a drop on it, and once I got an angle, I pulled the trigger. I used to hate shooting in holes before I got my Rob Allen, but the spring steel spare that comes with it is so durable I don't mind shooting in rocks. The tip of the spare stays sharp through all kinds of abuse, and the only problem is that they rust after a while. After putting the grunt on my carrier, I continued swimming around and ran into this nice Cero Mackerel. My shot placement was almost perfect with my spare going straight through the side of the fish's gill plate. However, for some reason the flopper came back out the same side I shot the fish from, and it was just holding on by a tiny piece of flesh. I played the fish super lightly and tried to bring it up before it would rip off, and as soon as it was in my reach, I rushed to grab its tail and then I pushed the spare through the other side so it wouldn't have a chance to escape. As soon as the fish was secure and in my hands, I brained and bled the fish to preserve meat quality and to put it onto my carrier. After taking that Cero in about 10 to 15 feet of water, I pushed a little deeper to around 20 and I ran into a really big strawberry grouper. When I first saw the fish, I tried to turn my camera on, but I was already recording and it ended up shutting off instead. I followed the fish around the reef and into this ledge, and once I was able to get an angle on it, I put a spare in the fish. It was only after I hit the surface that I found out that I had shut off my recording just before shooting the fish. When I went to turn off the GoPro, it ended up turning on, and that's when I knew that I had messed up. Because of that, the only footage of this fish that I got was me pulling it out from under the ledge. I really wish I had gotten that shot on camera because this was the same PB 2.5 pound grouper that I was talking about at the beginning of the video. However, that's not the only fish that I've messed up the recording on, and it definitely won't be the last. It was getting kinda late in the day and George had to go home, so after shooting that solid grouper, we got on the boat and dropped him off on shore. While we were heading home, I talked to Make It Happen and we decided to stop at one more mark before calling it a day. This zone that we stopped at is a part of the same reef where I had my first ever encounter with African Pompanos. A couple videos ago, I had shot a parrotfish and 3 massive APs swam in front of me while my gun wasn't loaded. I was out with Make It Happen on that day as well, and that's one of the main reasons we decided to stop at this spot. I was diving around for a while before this drop, and one of the main things that I noticed throughout all of my dives was that it was just empty. There was almost no sign of life, and I wasn't seeing anything even remotely close to the size that I would normally go for. I continued looking around for a while, but I just really wasn't feeling it, and I was at the point where I wanted to just go to the surface and call the boat. I continued grunting and looking around, but I just didn't have the patience to wait till the end of my breath hold. I was about halfway to the surface, and when I looked down I saw movement. It was an African Pompano, and I was not going to mess up my second chance. I had finally put a spare in my first African Pompano, and with a stone shot to add another level to that accomplishment. As soon as the fish got into my hands, I just started giggling like a little girl. This is a moment that I've been dreaming of ever since I found out that African Pompanos existed. It's something that I used to see people shooting on Instagram all the time when I was younger, and I just thought that seeing those crazy looking silverfish was the coolest thing ever. APs are also super rare in St. Lucia, and I've only heard of them being shot or caught on a handful of occasions. And looking at my own experiences, I've only seen African Pompanos on 4 different occasions to the date of this recording, with this one being my second ever. All of these things put me in a position where words just couldn't describe how I was feeling in that moment. This fish came in at 10 pounds and to me will forever be one of the most important fish that I've ever shot.
Yes, aye. Nice AP.
Having caught that African Pompano, I was just running off a high and I didn't really care what we did for the rest of the day. Make It Happen didn't really get any fish for himself on the last zone that we went to, so he suggested that we go to the shipwreck that we dove the day before. I didn't have any objections to this, and I thought it would be great to shoot some more schoolmasters and mahogany snappers. The place where I landed is the same area where I shot my schoolmaster the day before, and it looked like there was going to be fish around. I scanned for a bit, and just as I expected, I saw some nice schoolmasters and I just picked out the biggest one. I put down my fish of choice with a solid spine shot and I went to the surface. It was a pretty average sized schoolmaster, but definitely not a bad fish to end one of my most memorable days ever. That about wraps up all the footage from what was a couple of amazing days on the water. It's been about 6 months since I got this footage and I can still vividly remember everything that happened in those 2 days, and in particular shooting my first ever AP. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing because it lets me know that I'm doing something right. And if there's any suggestions that you have for future videos or things I could do differently in the future, let me know in the comments because all I really want to do is put out the best content that I possibly can. Also, stay tuned for next week's video because I shot a lot of really nice fish, with one of those being my first mutton snapper since my return from school. As always, thanks for watching and I hope to see you all next week. Later.